Number 1. Sydney Loofe. The Tinder date that ended in murder. Sydney Loofe was a vibrant 24-year-old woman living in Lincoln, Nebraska, working at a local Menards home improvement store and building a life filled with friends, family, and the simple joys that come with young adulthood. Like millions of people across the United States, Sydney turned to online dating as a way to meet new people in an increasingly digital world, downloading the popular dating application Tinder in the hopes of finding companionship and perhaps romance. In November 2017, Sydney matched with a woman named Aubrey, whose profile seemed normal enough, displaying pictures of an attractive woman seeking connection. The two exchanged messages and eventually agreed to meet in person, with Sydney excitedly telling friends and coworkers about her upcoming date. On November 15, 2017, Sydney met Aubrey for the first time, and according to her own social media posts and messages to friends, the date went well enough that she agreed to a second meeting the following evening. On November 16th, Sydney left her apartment to meet Aubrey once again, posting a Snapchat selfie that would become one of the last images of her alive, showing her looking happy and relaxed before heading out for what she believed would be another casual date. When Sydney failed to show up for work on November 17th and didn't respond to messages from concerned friends and family, alarm bells immediately began ringing among those who knew her well, as Sydney was known to be responsible and reliable, never the type to simply disappear without explanation. Her family reported her missing to the Lincoln Police Department, and investigators quickly began piecing together her last known movements, discovering through her phone records and social media activity that she had been communicating with someone on Tinder and had gone on dates on consecutive nights. The investigation intensified rapidly as days passed with no sign of Sydney, and law enforcement began examining surveillance footage from businesses near her apartment and along possible routes she might have taken. What they discovered was chilling. Sydney's car had been abandoned in a residential area of Lincoln, and there were no signs of her anywhere. As investigators dug deeper into the Tinder profile of the woman Sydney had been communicating with, they discovered that Aubrey was actually Bailey Boswell, a 23-year-old woman who lived with her boyfriend, Aubrey Trail, a 51-year-old man with an extensive criminal history including fraud and theft charges. Trail was a career criminal who had spent years manipulating others and running various scams, and his relationship with Boswell appeared to be deeply dysfunctional and potentially dangerous. When investigators located Boswell and Trail for questioning, both initially denied any involvement in Sydney's disappearance, but their stories were inconsistent and raised more questions than they answered. Trail, in particular, exhibited bizarre behavior during interviews, at one point claiming to be involved in witchcraft and supernatural practices, statements that investigators found both disturbing and indicative of someone attempting to create confusion or deflect from the truth. As the investigation continued, law enforcement obtained search warrants for the couple's apartment and vehicle, discovering evidence that would prove crucial to the case, including tools, garbage bags, and cleaning supplies that suggested someone had attempted to dispose of evidence or clean up after a violent crime. The breakthrough came when investigators found Sydney's dismembered remains scattered across various rural locations in Clay County, Nebraska, approximately 50 miles southwest of Lincoln, hidden in ditches and fields in a clear attempt to prevent discovery and identification. The horror of what had been done to Sydney shocked the community and devastated her family, who had held on to hope that she might still be found alive. Forensic examination of the remains and the evidence collected from Trail and Boswell's residence painted a gruesome picture of what had occurred. Sydney had been lured to the couple's apartment under the pretense of another date with Boswell, but once there, she had been murdered, her body dismembered, and the remains disposed of in multiple locations to hinder identification and investigation. Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail were both arrested and charged with first-degree murder, improper disposal of human remains, and conspiracy to commit murder. As the case proceeded toward trial, more disturbing details emerged about the couple's relationship and their possible motivations. Prosecutors presented evidence suggesting that Trail had fantasized about killing someone and that Boswell had been complicit in luring Sydney to her death, using the Tinder platform as a hunting ground to find a victim. Trail's history of manipulation and control became a central theme in understanding the dynamics of the crime, with evidence suggesting he had influenced Boswell to participate in his violent fantasies. During Trail's trial in 2019, he made the stunning admission in court that he had killed Sydney Loofe, claiming that Boswell was innocent and had no knowledge of his intentions, a statement that prosecutors argued was yet another manipulation attempt designed to protect his girlfriend and potentially secure a lesser sentence for her. Trail's courtroom behavior was erratic and theatrical, at one point slashing his own throat during proceedings in what appeared to be either a suicide attempt or an attention-seeking gesture, requiring medical intervention and causing a temporary halt to the trial. Despite his claims that Boswell was innocent, evidence presented at trial contradicted this narrative, showing that Boswell had been an active participant in both the planning and execution of the crime, as well as the disposal of Sydney's body. The jury deliberated and found Aubrey Trail guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human skeletal remains. He was sentenced to death, becoming one of the few individuals on Nebraska's death row. Bailey Boswell faced her own separate trial in 2020, where prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of her participation in the crime, including her role in luring Sydney through the Tinder application, her presence during the murder, and her active involvement in dismembering and disposing of the body. The defense attempted to portray Boswell as a victim of Trail's manipulation and control, arguing that she had been psychologically dominated by the older man and coerced into participating in acts she would never have committed on her own. However, the evidence, including text messages, internet searches, and witness testimony, suggested that Boswell had been a willing participant who understood exactly what was happening and made conscious choices to participate in the horrific crime. The jury found Bailey Boswell guilty on all counts, and she too was sentenced to death, making her only the third woman on death row in Nebraska's history and one of the youngest women in the United States to receive a capital sentence. The case of Sydney Loofe sent shockwaves through the online dating community and prompted widespread discussion about the safety measures, or lack thereof, on dating platforms like Tinder. Sydney's family became advocates for greater awareness about the potential dangers of meeting strangers through dating apps, emphasizing the importance of safety precautions such as meeting in public places, telling friends or family about plans, sharing location information, and trusting instincts when something feels wrong. The tragedy highlighted how predators can exploit the trust and openness that dating platforms encourage, using the anonymity and ease of online connections to identify and target vulnerable victims. Dating app companies responded to high-profile cases like Sydney's by implementing additional safety features, including panic buttons, photo verification systems, and educational resources about safe dating practices. Though critics argue these measures are often inadequate and implemented too slowly, Sydney's death also raised questions about how thoroughly dating platforms screen users and whether they have a responsibility to conduct background checks or flag users with criminal histories, a debate that continues as online dating becomes increasingly normalized and widespread. The case remains a stark reminder that while technology has revolutionized how people meet and form relationships, it has also created new avenues for predators to access victims, and that the same tools that facilitate human connection can be weaponized by those with violent intentions. Sydney Loofe's family established a foundation in her memory to promote awareness about online dating safety and to support other families who have lost loved ones to violence, channeling their grief into efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The small Nebraska community where Sydney lived and worked was forever changed by her murder, with residents expressing both profound sadness at the loss of a young woman with so much potential and anger at the senseless brutality of her death. As of 2025, both Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell remain on death row in Nebraska, with their cases working through the appeals process that typically accompanies capital sentences, a process that can take many years or even decades to complete. The case continues to be studied by criminologists and psychologists interested in understanding the dynamics of couples who kill together, the psychology of predatory behavior in the digital age, and the ways in which online platforms can be exploited by those with malicious intent. Sydney's story serves as a tragic cautionary tale about the very real dangers that can lurk behind dating profiles and friendly messages, a reminder that not everyone online is who they claim to be, and that the consequences of a single date can be devastating and irreversible. Her memory lives on through the advocacy work of her family, the safety measures that have been implemented in response to her death, and the countless individuals who have learned from her story to be more cautious and aware when navigating the world of online dating. Number 2. Sharon Edwards. The Match.com murder. Sharon Edwards was a successful 45-year-old nurse living in suburban Detroit, Michigan, a divorced mother of 2 teenage children who had spent years focusing on her career and family before deciding to re-enter the dating world in search of companionship and possibly a long-term relationship. After her divorce several years earlier, Sharon had thrown herself into her work at a local hospital and into raising her children. But as they grew more independent and she found herself with more free time, she began to feel ready to open her heart to the possibility of love again. Like many single professionals in the mid-2000s, Sharon turned to Match.com, one of the most established and reputable online dating platforms at the time, believing that a paid subscription service would attract more serious individuals genuinely interested in meaningful connections rather than casual encounters. Sharon created a profile that honestly represented who she was: a hardworking, family-oriented woman who enjoyed quiet evenings at home, gardening, reading, and the occasional night out with friends, and she began exchanging messages with various men who seemed compatible based on their profiles and shared interests. Among the men who contacted Sharon was someone using the name Tom, whose profile presented him as a successful businessman in his early 50s, divorced, financially stable, and looking for a serious relationship with an intelligent, independent woman. Tom's messages to Sharon were charming and attentive, filled with compliments about her profile and expressions of interest in getting to know her better, and he seemed to understand the challenges of dating later in life after a divorce. Over several weeks in early 2011, Sharon and Tom exchanged increasingly personal messages, discussing their past relationships, their children, their career aspirations, and their hopes for the future, building what Sharon believed was a genuine connection based on shared values and mutual attraction. Tom claimed to own a successful construction business and travel frequently for work, which explained why he sometimes took days to respond to messages, a detail that Sharon accepted without suspicion as it seemed consistent with the life of a busy professional. After nearly a month of online communication, Tom suggested they meet in person for dinner at a nice restaurant in a safe, public location, and Sharon agreed, excited and nervous about finally putting a face to the messages and voice she had come to enjoy. The date in early March 2011 went well by all accounts, with Sharon later telling friends that Tom had been a gentleman, paying for dinner, asking thoughtful questions, and seeming genuinely interested in her life and experiences. They agreed to see each other again, and over the following weeks, Sharon and Tom met for several more dates, each time deepening what Sharon believed was a growing relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. However, what Sharon didn't know was that Tom was actually Theodore Cross, a 48-year-old man with a lengthy criminal record including fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, and a history of targeting vulnerable women for financial scams. Cross had created multiple fake profiles on various dating websites using stolen photos and fabricated biographical information, presenting himself as a successful businessman when in reality he was unemployed, deeply in debt, and facing potential criminal charges for previous fraudulent activities. His pattern was to identify women who appeared financially stable and emotionally vulnerable, often divorcees or widows looking for companionship, gain their trust through romantic attention, and then manipulate them into providing money, access to credit cards, or other financial assistance under various pretenses. As Sharon's relationship with Tom progressed, he began to share carefully constructed stories about temporary financial difficulties, explaining that he had money tied up in business deals or investments that would pay off soon, but that he was experiencing short-term cash flow problems. Sharon, who had been raised to be generous and helpful, and who genuinely cared for Tom and believed in the relationship they were building, offered to help with small amounts of money here and there, loans that Tom promised to repay as soon as his business deals closed. Over the course of several months, these small loans escalated into larger amounts, with Tom presenting increasingly urgent financial needs and Sharon providing assistance because she trusted him and believed in their future together. By the summer of 2011, Sharon had loaned Tom nearly $50,000, draining her savings account and even taking out a home equity line of credit against the house she had worked so hard to maintain after her divorce. When Tom's promised repayments never materialized and his excuses became more elaborate and less believable, Sharon began to suspect something was wrong and started asking more direct questions about his finances and business dealings. Tom's responses became defensive and evasive, and he began creating distance in the relationship, claiming that work obligations required him to travel extensively and that he needed time to focus on resolving his business issues. When Sharon attempted to contact Tom's supposed place of business, she discovered that the company he claimed to own didn't exist at the address he had provided, and further investigation revealed that much of what he had told her about his professional life was fabricated. Feeling betrayed and foolish, Sharon confronted Tom via phone and email, demanding the return of her money and threatening to contact authorities if he didn't comply. Tom responded with a mix of apologies and additional excuses, promising to repay her soon but continuing to delay and deflect. Frustrated and increasingly desperate to recover her financial losses, Sharon agreed to meet Tom in person one more time in August 2011 to discuss repayment, arranging to meet at a location that Tom suggested, a decision that would prove to be fatal. Sharon told a close friend about the planned meeting and expressed some nervousness about seeing Tom again given the circumstances, but she believed that a face-to-face conversation might finally produce results and allow her to recover at least some of her money. On August 18, 2011, Sharon drove to the agreed-upon meeting location, a somewhat isolated area near an industrial park on the outskirts of Detroit, and was never seen alive again. When Sharon failed to return home that evening and didn't answer calls from her worried children, her family immediately contacted police, knowing that it was completely unlike Sharon to be unreachable or to miss commitments to her family. Investigators quickly identified Theodore Cross as a person of interest based on information from Sharon's friends about her relationship and the planned meeting, and they began attempting to locate him for questioning. Cross had disappeared, abandoning his rental apartment and disconnecting his phone, behavior that strongly suggested consciousness of guilt. A massive search operation was launched to find Sharon, with volunteers combing areas around the last known meeting location and investigators working to track Cross's movements and possible whereabouts. 3 days after Sharon's disappearance, her body was discovered in a wooded area approximately 20 miles from where she had planned to meet Cross, showing clear signs of having been murdered. She had been strangled and her body hastily concealed under brush and debris in an apparent attempt to hide evidence of the crime. The discovery devastated Sharon's family and friends, who had desperately hoped she might still be found alive, and it transformed what had been a missing persons case into a homicide investigation with Theodore Cross as the primary suspect. Forensic evidence collected from Sharon's body and the crime scene, including DNA evidence and trace materials, would later prove crucial in connecting Cross to the murder. A nationwide manhunt ensued, with Cross's photo and information distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country and featured on crime alert programs, as investigators believed he might have fled Michigan entirely to avoid arrest. The break in the case came when Cross was spotted by a vigilant police officer in New Mexico several weeks after the murder, leading to a high-speed chase and eventual apprehension. During interviews after his arrest, Cross initially denied any involvement in Sharon's death, claiming that he had met with her as planned, that they had argued about money, and that she had left angry but alive, an account that physical evidence and timeline analysis would prove to be false. As investigators built their case, they uncovered evidence suggesting that Cross had planned to kill Sharon to prevent her from reporting his fraudulent activities to authorities and to eliminate the witness who could testify to his crimes, viewing murder as a solution to his escalating legal and financial problems. The case went to trial in 2013, with prosecutors presenting a comprehensive narrative of how Cross had used online dating platforms to identify and target Sharon, how he had systematically defrauded her of her life savings through manipulation and false promises, and how he had ultimately murdered her when she demanded accountability and threatened to expose him. The evidence included financial records documenting the transfers of money from Sharon to Cross, communications between them that showed the evolution of their relationship and his escalating requests for financial assistance, testimony from Sharon's friends and family about her state of mind and the information she had shared with them, and forensic evidence linking Cross to the crime scene where Sharon's body was found. The defense attempted to argue that Sharon's death had been the result of an argument that had turned violent unintentionally, suggesting a lesser charge of manslaughter rather than premeditated murder. But prosecutors successfully demonstrated that Cross had lured Sharon to an isolated location with the specific intent to kill her and had taken steps to conceal the crime afterward. The jury found Theodore Cross guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, fraud, and multiple counts of identity theft and financial crimes related both to Sharon's case and to other victims who came forward during the investigation. Cross was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable women or harm anyone else. The case of Sharon Edwards became one of the most widely publicized examples of the potential dangers of online dating, particularly for individuals who are trusting and generous by nature. Her death prompted Match.com and other dating platforms to implement enhanced safety measures and screening processes, though critics argued that these changes were reactive rather than proactive and insufficient to prevent determined predators from creating profiles. Sharon's children, who had lost their mother in such a senseless and preventable tragedy, became advocates for greater regulation of online dating platforms and for mandatory background checks of users, arguing that companies profiting from facilitating romantic connections have a responsibility to protect their customers from known criminals. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of divorced or widowed individuals re-entering the dating world after years out of circulation, who may be less familiar with common online scams and may be more susceptible to manipulation due to loneliness or a genuine desire for companionship. Experts in online fraud and romance scams point to Sharon's case as a textbook example of how predators operate, building trust gradually, creating a believable persona, exploiting emotional connections to extract financial resources, and ultimately resorting to violence when their schemes are threatened. The financial fraud aspect of the case was particularly devastating to Sharon's family, who not only lost a beloved mother, daughter, and sister, but also saw her lifetime of hard work and careful saving stolen by a con artist in a matter of months. Sharon's case remains a frequently cited example in law enforcement training materials about investigating crimes that originate in online spaces and the importance of taking seriously reports from individuals who believe they have been defrauded through dating websites. Her story has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and articles as a cautionary tale about the very real dangers that can exist behind seemingly normal dating profiles, and as a reminder that people are not always who they claim to be online. As of 2025, Theodore Cross remains incarcerated in a Michigan state prison, having exhausted most of his appeals, and investigators believe that Sharon was not his only victim, though she was likely the only one he murdered, with other women having come forward to report similar experiences of being defrauded by Cross through online dating platforms. Sharon's children have worked to keep their mother's memory alive not through the tragedy of her death, but through remembering her as the caring, hardworking, generous person she was, and through their advocacy work aimed at preventing other families from experiencing similar losses. The case stands as a sobering reminder that the convenience and accessibility of online dating come with real risks that must be taken seriously, and that the same technologies that can facilitate genuine human connections can also be exploited by predators with lethal intentions. Number 3. Ingrid Lyne. The 4th of July horror. Ingrid Lyne was a vibrant 40-year-old single mother of 3 daughters living in Renton, Washington, working as a nurse at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle, where she was known for her compassion, dedication to her patients, and professional competence. Ingrid had been divorced for several years and was successfully managing the challenging balance of a demanding career and raising 3 daughters. But like many single parents, she longed for adult companionship and the possibility of building a romantic relationship with someone who would enrich her life and potentially become part of her family. In the spring of 2016, Ingrid created a profile on a popular online dating website, presenting herself honestly as a working mother seeking a meaningful connection with someone kind, stable, and interested in a serious relationship. She began communicating with various men through the platform, approaching online dating with cautious optimism and the hope that she might find someone compatible. Among the men who contacted Ingrid was John Robert Charlton, a 40-year-old man whose profile seemed unremarkable and whose early messages appeared normal enough. Friendly, polite, expressing interest in getting to know her better. What Ingrid didn't know, and what the dating platform's minimal screening processes had failed to reveal, was that Charlton had an extensive and deeply troubling criminal history that included violent offenses, sex crimes, and a pattern of dangerous behavior toward women. Charlton had previously been convicted of rape, had served time in prison, and was registered as a sex offender, facts that would have certainly influenced Ingrid's decision to communicate with him had she known, but which were not disclosed by the dating platform or discovered through any cursory background check she might have conducted on her own. Over the course of several weeks in May and June 2016, Ingrid and Charlton exchanged messages and had phone conversations, with Ingrid apparently not detecting any immediate red flags in his communication style or the information he shared about himself, as Charlton was skilled at presenting a normal, non-threatening persona in the early stages of meeting potential victims. They eventually arranged to meet in person for a date on July 8, 2016, coinciding with the 4th of July holiday weekend, planning to attend a Seattle Mariners baseball game at Safeco Field, a public venue that seemed like a safe and appropriate location for a first date. Ingrid was excited about the date and mentioned her plans to friends and family, sharing some of the details about the man she would be meeting, though she did not have extensive information about his background or real identity, as is common in early-stage online dating situations. On the evening of July 8th, Ingrid met Charlton and they attended the baseball game together, appearing to casual observers as just another couple among the thousands of fans enjoying the holiday weekend festivities and sporting event. After the game concluded, rather than ending the date and going their separate ways as would have been a safer choice, Ingrid agreed to go with Charlton to his residence in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood, a decision that would have devastating consequences. What happened in Charlton's home in the early morning hours of July 9, 2016, was a brutal and sadistic attack that ended with Ingrid's murder and the dismemberment of her body in a crime so horrific that it shocked even veteran homicide investigators accustomed to seeing the worst of human depravity. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong came on the morning of July 9th, when a person taking out trash at a residential building in Seattle's Central District discovered human remains in a recycling bin, specifically, a human arm and leg that had been dismembered and packaged in plastic bags before being disposed of in the communal waste area. The discovery prompted an immediate response from Seattle Police Department homicide detectives, who quickly secured the scene and began the grim work of collecting evidence and attempting to identify the victim. Additional body parts were discovered in nearby bins and surrounding areas, indicating that the killer had attempted to dispose of the remains in multiple locations, perhaps believing that scattering the evidence would prevent identification or delay the investigation. Medical examiner personnel worked to piece together the remains and extract any identifying information, including fingerprints and dental records, while investigators canvassed the area for witnesses and surveillance footage that might provide clues about who had disposed of the body parts and when. The identification process was complicated by the condition of the remains and the fact that they had been dismembered, but through painstaking forensic work, investigators were able to obtain fingerprints that matched those on file for Ingrid Lyne, providing a definitive identification and transforming what had been an unknown victim case into a specific homicide investigation with a victim whose life, family, and recent activities could be traced and examined. Ingrid's family was notified of the devastating discovery and immediately contacted by investigators seeking information about her recent activities, whereabouts, and any people she had been in contact with in the days before her disappearance. Ingrid's friends provided crucial information about her planned date on July 8th, including details they knew about the man she was supposed to meet, and investigators immediately began working to identify and locate John Robert Charlton. A review of Ingrid's phone records, email accounts, and dating website messages provided a clear trail of communication between her and Charlton, establishing that they had planned to meet and that she had likely been with him on the night she disappeared. When investigators attempted to locate Charlton, they discovered he had abandoned his apartment shortly after the murder, leaving behind evidence that would prove critical to the prosecution, including blood spatter, tissue matter, cutting tools, and other materials consistent with the dismemberment of a human body. The forensic evidence collected from Charlton's residence painted a horrific picture of what had occurred. Ingrid had been killed in the apartment, likely through blunt force trauma and strangulation, and her body had then been systematically dismembered in the bathtub using saws and knives, with the killer taking time to package the remains in plastic bags before disposing of them in various locations around the city. The level of violence and the methodical nature of the dismemberment suggested a perpetrator who was either completely dissociated from the humanity of his victim or who derived some satisfaction from the act of destruction itself, possibilities that deeply disturbed investigators and prosecutors. A massive manhunt was launched to locate Charlton, who had effectively vanished in the days following the murder, likely aware that the discovery of Ingrid's remains was imminent and that investigators would quickly identify him as the primary suspect. Charlton's car was found abandoned, and there were indications he had withdrawn cash from ATMs and might be attempting to flee the region entirely. The public nature of the crime and the horrific details that emerged in media coverage generated widespread fear and anger in the Seattle community, with many expressing outrage that a convicted sex offender had been able to access dating platforms and target another victim despite his documented history of violence against women. The case raised serious questions about the responsibility of dating websites to screen users and prevent known dangerous offenders from creating profiles, with many arguing that Ingrid's death could have been prevented if basic background checks had been implemented. After several days as a fugitive, John Robert Charlton was apprehended by law enforcement in Oregon, where he had fled in an attempt to avoid arrest, and he was extradited back to Washington state to face murder charges. During interviews with investigators, Charlton provided inconsistent and implausible explanations for what had happened, at various points claiming that Ingrid's death had been accidental, that she had attacked him first, and that he had panicked and dismembered her body out of fear rather than as part of a planned crime, explanations that prosecutors would later thoroughly discredit through forensic evidence and crime scene analysis. Charlton was charged with first-degree murder, and the case proceeded to trial in 2018 amid intense public scrutiny and media coverage. The prosecution presented overwhelming forensic evidence connecting Charlton to the murder and dismemberment, including DNA evidence from the crime scene, blood spatter analysis, digital evidence from Ingrid's phone and computer showing her communications with Charlton and her plans to meet him, surveillance footage from the baseball game and surrounding areas placing them together, and testimony from forensic pathologists about the nature of Ingrid's injuries and the process of dismemberment. The defense attempted to argue that Ingrid's death had not been premeditated murder but rather the result of a situation that had escalated unexpectedly, suggesting that Charlton should be convicted of a lesser charge such as second-degree murder or manslaughter. But this argument was undermined by the evidence of how methodically and deliberately he had dismembered and disposed of her body, actions that suggested consciousness of guilt and an attempt to avoid detection rather than the panic response he claimed. The trial also brought to light the full extent of Charlton's criminal history, including his previous rape conviction and the circumstances that had led to his requirement to register as a sex offender. Information that painted a picture of a man with a documented pattern of violent behavior toward women who should never have had the opportunity to access potential victims through dating platforms. The jury deliberated and found John Robert Charlton guilty of first-degree murder, and he was subsequently sentenced to 50 years in prison, effectively a life sentence given his age at the time of conviction. The case of Ingrid Lyne became a catalyst for renewed calls to regulate online dating platforms and require them to implement comprehensive background screening of users, with Ingrid's family and advocates arguing that companies facilitating romantic connections between strangers have a moral and potentially legal responsibility to protect their users from known dangerous individuals. Several states introduced or passed legislation in the years following Ingrid's murder requiring dating platforms to disclose whether they conduct background checks and to provide safety information to users, though implementation and enforcement of these requirements has been inconsistent. The dating industry has generally resisted mandatory background check requirements, arguing that such measures would be expensive to implement, might create a false sense of security among users, and could be circumvented by determined offenders using false identities, though critics counter that these concerns do not justify allowing known sex offenders and violent criminals unfettered access to platforms specifically designed to facilitate intimate encounters. Ingrid's 3 daughters, who lost their mother in such a senseless and preventable tragedy, have had to navigate the trauma of her death and the knowledge of the horrific violence inflicted upon her, challenges that have required extensive therapeutic support and the care of family members and loved ones. The Seattle nursing community mourned the loss of Ingrid, who had been a dedicated healthcare professional committed to caring for others, and her colleagues established a memorial fund in her name to support nursing education and patient care initiatives. The case remains a frequent reference point in discussions about online dating safety, with experts pointing to Ingrid's experience as evidence that even cautious, intelligent individuals can become victims when dating platforms fail to implement adequate safety measures and when predators are able to hide their true identities and histories. Ingrid's story has been featured in numerous true crime programs, articles, and safety awareness campaigns as a tragic example of what can happen when the convenience and accessibility of online dating are not balanced with appropriate safety protocols and user protection mechanisms. As of 2025, John Robert Charlton remains incarcerated in Washington state, and there is ongoing advocacy work aimed at implementing Ingrid's law, proposed legislation that would require dating platforms to conduct criminal background checks on all users and disclose the results to potential matches, though such legislation faces significant opposition from the technology and dating industries. Ingrid Lyne's memory is honored not through the manner of her death, but through remembering her as a caring mother, dedicated nurse, and person who deserved safety and protection when she sought companionship through what should have been a legitimate and safe avenue for meeting people. Her case stands as a stark reminder that the failure to properly screen and monitor users on dating platforms can have deadly consequences, and that the responsibility for preventing such tragedies must be shared by the platforms that profit from facilitating these connections, the users who must exercise caution and awareness, and the regulatory bodies that have the power to impose and enforce safety standards. Number 4. Jette Jacobs. The OkCupid killer's trail of deception. Jette Jacobs was a 33-year-old graduate student and aspiring writer living in Seattle, Washington, pursuing her master's degree in creative writing at the University of Washington while working part-time at a local bookstore to support herself through her studies. Jette was known among her friends and family as an intelligent, creative, and deeply empathetic person who had a gift for understanding human nature and translating those insights into compelling fiction and poetry. Like many busy graduate students juggling academic work, employment, and personal life, Jette found it challenging to meet potential romantic partners through traditional means and decided to try online dating, creating a profile on OkCupid in early 2013 that highlighted her love of literature, hiking in the Pacific Northwest, and her passion for social justice causes. Her profile attracted messages from various men, and Jette approached these interactions with both openness and a healthy degree of caution, meeting potential dates in public places and sharing information about her plans with friends. Among the men who contacted Jette was someone calling himself Brian, whose profile presented him as a 38-year-old software engineer working for a tech company in the Seattle area, claiming to be well-educated, financially stable, and interested in finding a serious relationship with an intellectual equal. Brian's messages to Jette were articulate and thoughtful, referencing books and authors, discussing current events and social issues, and asking perceptive questions about her writing and academic work, creating the impression of someone who was genuinely interested in her as a person rather than just seeking casual encounters. Over several weeks in February and March 2013, Jette and Brian exchanged lengthy messages covering topics ranging from philosophy and politics to their personal histories and relationship goals, building what Jette believed was a meaningful connection with someone who shared her values and interests. What Jette didn't know was that Brian was actually Wade Wilson, a 41-year-old drifter with an extensive criminal history spanning multiple states, including convictions for theft, burglary, assault, and domestic violence, who had been using dating websites to identify and target vulnerable women for years. Wilson had developed a sophisticated method for creating convincing fake identities online, stealing photos from social media accounts of real people, fabricating biographical details that would appeal to educated, progressive women, and carefully crafting his communication style to match the expectations and preferences of his targets. His pattern was to build trust through extended online communication, establish what appeared to be a genuine emotional connection, arrange to meet in person, and then exploit the situation for various purposes including theft, sexual assault, or in some cases, more serious violence. Wilson had moved to the Seattle area in late 2012 after leaving California, where he had been questioned but not charged in connection with the disappearance of another woman he had met through online dating, a case that remained unsolved and would later become relevant to investigators examining his activities. When Jette and Brian finally agreed to meet in person in late March 2013, they planned to have coffee at a popular cafe near the University of Washington campus, a public location that Jette considered safe and appropriate for a first meeting. The date appeared to go well, with Jette later telling a friend that Brian had been engaging in person, that the conversation had flowed naturally, and that she was interested in seeing him again despite noticing some minor inconsistencies between what he had told her online and what he said in person, discrepancies she attributed to normal nervousness or misremembering details rather than deliberate deception. Over the following weeks, Jette and Brian met several more times, gradually building what Jette believed was the foundation of a relationship, though she continued to have some nagging doubts about aspects of Brian's story that didn't quite add up, including his vague descriptions of his work, his reluctance to introduce her to friends or coworkers, and his tendency to be evasive when she asked specific questions about his background. Despite these concerns, Jette's natural inclination to see the best in people and her desire for companionship led her to continue the relationship, rationalizing away the red flags and telling herself she was being overly suspicious. In late April 2013, Brian told Jette that he needed to travel to Portland, Oregon, for work-related meetings and suggested that she come with him for the weekend, framing it as an opportunity to spend more uninterrupted time together away from the distractions of their daily routines. Jette was hesitant about the idea of traveling with someone she had only known for a few weeks, but Brian was persuasive, emphasizing how much he enjoyed her company and how the trip would allow them to deepen their connection, and he offered to pay for all expenses, presenting it as a romantic gesture rather than an imposition. After some deliberation and despite her instinctive reservations, Jette agreed to the trip, telling several friends about her plans and promising to check in regularly over the weekend. Safety precautions that would ultimately prove insufficient but would provide crucial information to investigators. On April 26, 2013, Jette met Brian in Seattle, and they drove together to Portland in his car, a journey that by all external appearances seemed like a normal weekend getaway for a couple in the early stages of a relationship. They checked into a hotel in downtown Portland, and according to surveillance footage and witness accounts, they were seen together at dinner that evening at a restaurant near the hotel, appearing to be engaged in normal conversation without any obvious signs of distress or conflict. What happened in the hotel room in the hours after they returned from dinner would remain partially unclear, but the outcome was unambiguous and horrific. At some point during the night or early morning hours of April 27th, Wade Wilson attacked Jette Jacobs in a violent assault that left her severely injured, bound with duct tape, and fighting for her life in a situation from which she had no realistic chance of escape or rescue. Wilson's attack on Jette appeared to have been sexually motivated and sadistic in nature, involving prolonged torture and degradation that suggested he derived pleasure from inflicting pain and exerting total control over his victim. At some point during the assault, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of the violence inflicted upon her, Jette died from a combination of blunt force trauma to the head and asphyxiation caused by the restraints Wilson had used to immobilize her. After killing Jette, Wilson made efforts to conceal the crime and delay discovery of her body, wrapping her remains in bedding from the hotel room and hiding them in the bathroom, then methodically cleaning the room to remove obvious evidence of violence before checking out of the hotel early on the morning of April 27th and fleeing the area in his car. Hotel staff discovered Jette's body later that day when they entered the room for cleaning and immediately contacted Portland police, who arrived to find a horrific crime scene that clearly indicated a violent homicide had occurred. The investigation moved rapidly, with detectives reviewing hotel records to identify who had checked into the room, examining surveillance footage to track the movements of Jette and her companion, and attempting to identify the man she had been with based on the registration information, which of course listed the fake name Brian, along with false contact information. The breakthrough came when investigators contacted Jette's friends and family in Seattle to inform them of her death and gather information about her recent activities, leading them to discover her communications with Brian on OkCupid, which provided a trail of digital evidence including messages, photos from his profile, and details about his supposed identity. A reverse image search on the photos Wilson had used in his dating profile revealed that they had been stolen from a real software engineer's LinkedIn account, someone who had no connection to the crime and was shocked to learn his images had been misappropriated for such a purpose. Seattle Police Department detectives who were familiar with similar cases in their jurisdiction recognized elements of Wilson's modus operandi and began cross-referencing unsolved cases involving women who had met men through dating websites and subsequently disappeared or been assaulted. This investigation revealed that Wilson had been active on multiple dating platforms under various fake identities across several states over a period of years, and that Jette was almost certainly not his first victim, though she may have been the first he had killed, or at least the first whose murder had been discovered and connected to him. A multi-state manhunt was launched to locate Wilson, whose real identity was eventually determined through a combination of forensic evidence from the hotel room, including fingerprints and DNA, and investigative work tracing his actual movements and known associates. Wilson had an extensive arrest record under his real name, and his fingerprints were on file from previous convictions, allowing investigators to make a positive identification and issue warrants for his arrest on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Wilson remained at large for nearly 3 weeks, during which time he traveled through Oregon, California, and Nevada, possibly attempting to flee to Mexico or simply staying mobile to avoid capture, before being apprehended in a motel in Las Vegas by local police who had been alerted to be on the lookout for him. Upon his arrest, Wilson initially refused to speak with investigators and requested an attorney, maintaining his silence even when confronted with overwhelming evidence connecting him to Jette's murder. As the case proceeded toward trial, prosecutors in Oregon where the murder had occurred built a comprehensive case against Wilson, presenting evidence that included forensic materials from the crime scene, surveillance footage placing him and Jette at the hotel, digital evidence of their online communications and his use of a false identity, testimony from witnesses who had seen them together, and expert analysis of the injuries Jette had sustained and the manner of her death. The defense faced a nearly impossible task given the strength of the evidence, and their strategy centered on attempting to negotiate a plea agreement that would allow Wilson to avoid the death penalty in exchange for a guilty plea, an offer that prosecutors initially rejected given the heinous nature of the crime and the evidence of premeditation and planning. During pretrial proceedings, additional information emerged about Wilson's history that painted a disturbing picture of a serial predator who had been targeting women through dating websites for years. Investigators in California, Washington, and Arizona came forward with cases of women who had reported being assaulted or robbed by men they had met online, and in several instances, the descriptions and circumstances matched Wilson's known patterns. Most disturbingly, the case of a missing woman from San Diego who had last been seen going on a date with someone she had met on OkCupid in 2011 showed remarkable similarities to Jette's case, and investigators strongly suspected Wilson's involvement. Though without a body or definitive evidence, they could not bring formal charges. The revelation that Jette might have been one victim among many, and that Wilson had been able to continue his predatory behavior across state lines and multiple dating platforms for years without being stopped, sparked outrage and led to calls for better coordination between law enforcement agencies in tracking online predators and for dating websites to implement more rigorous screening and verification processes. In 2015, facing overwhelming evidence and the likelihood of a death sentence if convicted at trial, Wade Wilson accepted a plea agreement in which he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty but ensuring he would never be released. As part of the plea agreement, Wilson was required to provide information about other potential victims and to cooperate with investigators from other jurisdictions examining unsolved cases, though the information he provided was incomplete and self-serving, likely minimizing his involvement in other crimes. The case of Jette Jacobs highlighted numerous systemic failures that allowed Wilson to prey on multiple victims over an extended period. The lack of coordination between law enforcement agencies in different states meant that his pattern of behavior was not identified until after Jette's murder. The ease with which he was able to create fake identities on dating platforms using stolen photos and fabricated information revealed the inadequacy of verification processes, and the fact that his extensive criminal record did not prevent him from accessing dating websites demonstrated the absence of meaningful background screening. Jette's family, devastated by her loss and the circumstances of her death, became advocates for stronger regulations of online dating platforms and for the implementation of verification systems that would make it more difficult for predators to create fake profiles and target victims. The University of Washington community where Jette had been pursuing her graduate studies held memorial services honoring her memory and her contributions as a writer and student, with several of her professors and classmates sharing excerpts from her work and reflecting on her talent and potential that had been so violently cut short. Jette's creative writing, which often explored themes of human vulnerability, trust, and betrayal, took on a tragic, ironic significance in light of how she died, and some of her work was published posthumously in literary journals as a way of preserving her voice and artistic legacy. The case received significant media coverage and has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries and podcasts as an example of the dangers posed by online predators who use dating platforms to identify and access victims, and as a cautionary tale about the limitations of personal safety measures when perpetrators are skilled at deception and manipulation. Experts in online safety and digital crime point to Jette's case as demonstrating that even intelligent, cautious individuals can fall victim to sophisticated predators who invest time and effort into building trust and creating convincing false identities, and that the responsibility for preventing such crimes cannot rest solely on potential victims, but must also be shared by the platforms that facilitate these connections and the law enforcement and regulatory systems that should be monitoring and preventing predatory behavior. As of 2025, Wade Wilson remains incarcerated in an Oregon state prison, and investigators continue to examine cold cases involving missing or murdered women who may have been his victims. though many of these cases remain unsolved due to the passage of time and the difficulty of connecting Wilson definitively to crimes he has refused to discuss fully. Jette Jacobs is remembered by those who knew her not as a victim defined by the tragedy of her death, but as a talented writer, caring friend, dedicated student, and person whose life had value and meaning that extended far beyond the circumstances of how it ended. A memory that her family and friends worked to preserve through their advocacy and through sharing her writing and celebrating her accomplishments. Number 5. Ashley Lindsay. The Facebook romance turned fatal Ashley Lindsay was a 28-year-old special education teacher living in a small town in rural Missouri, dedicated to working with children with developmental disabilities and known throughout her community as someone with infinite patience, creativity in adapting lessons to meet individual needs, and genuine love for her students. Ashley had grown up in the area, graduated from a regional university with a degree in education, and returned to her hometown to teach, finding deep satisfaction in making a difference in the lives of children who needed extra support and advocacy. Her personal life had been less settled than her professional career, with a previous long-term relationship having ended several years earlier, leaving Ashley single and occasionally lonely in a small town where the pool of potential romantic partners was limited and where many people her age had already married or moved away. In the spring of 2014, Ashley became more active on Facebook, not just using it to stay in touch with friends and family, but also joining community groups and engaging with people who shared her interests in teaching, outdoor activities, and animal rescue. Through one of these groups, Ashley connected with someone named Marcus, whose Facebook profile indicated he was a 32-year-old construction worker living about an hour away in a neighboring county, someone who seemed to share her rural background and values. Marcus's profile showed him in various outdoor settings, hunting, fishing, working on vehicles, and his posts reflected what appeared to be a wholesome, working-class lifestyle that resonated with Ashley's own background and preferences. They began exchanging private messages on Facebook in April 2014, initially discussing mutual interests and the challenges of meeting people in rural areas, then gradually sharing more personal information about their lives, families, past relationships, and hopes for the future. Marcus presented himself as a single father with partial custody of a young son, a detail that Ashley found endearing and that aligned with her work with children, and he claimed to be looking for a serious relationship with someone who understood rural life and valued family. Over several weeks, their conversations became increasingly frequent and intimate, with Marcus expressing strong feelings for Ashley and telling her that he felt a deep connection with her unlike anything he had experienced before, language that Ashley found flattering and that fed her hope of finding a meaningful relationship. What Ashley didn't know was that Marcus was actually using a false identity, that the photos on his profile had been taken from someone else's social media account, and that the person she was communicating with was not who he claimed to be at all. The real identity of the person behind the Marcus profile was David Trenton, a 43-year-old man with a criminal history including domestic violence, stalking, and violation of protective orders, who had been using fake Facebook profiles to contact and manipulate women for several years. Trenton had a documented pattern of becoming obsessively fixated on women, using deception to initiate contact and build relationships, then becoming controlling, possessive, and violent when his targets tried to distance themselves or end the relationship. He had been through multiple failed relationships, several of which had ended with restraining orders being filed against him, and he had served time in county jail for violating one of these orders by repeatedly contacting and threatening a former girlfriend. After his release from jail in 2013, Trenton had moved to a different area of Missouri and begun using social media to contact women under fake identities, believing that the distance and deception would allow him to avoid the consequences that had resulted from his previous behavior. His selection of victims seemed to follow a pattern. He targeted women who lived in rural areas, who worked in caregiving professions like teaching or nursing, who had limited social circles based on their Facebook activity, and who seemed from their posts and photos to be somewhat isolated or lonely, characteristics that Trenton apparently believed would make them more susceptible to his manipulation and less likely to have strong support networks that might interfere with his plans. After several weeks of online communication, Marcus suggested to Ashley that they should meet in person, proposing a dinner date at a restaurant located roughly halfway between their supposed locations, a suggestion that seemed reasonable and thoughtful to Ashley. They arranged to meet on the evening of May 23, 2014, with Ashley telling several friends and coworkers about her plans and sharing what information she had about Marcus, including screenshots of his Facebook profile and the general area where they would be meeting. Ashley was excited but also somewhat nervous about the date, as it would be her first serious attempt at romantic connection in quite some time, and she spent considerable time preparing, selecting an outfit, and thinking about conversation topics. She drove to the designated meeting location, a chain restaurant in a small town between where she lived and where she believed Marcus lived, arriving on time and watching for someone who matched the photos she had seen on his Facebook profile. When a man approached her in the parking lot and identified himself as Marcus, Ashley immediately noticed that he looked significantly different from his profile photos. Older, heavier, and less physically attractive than the images had suggested, but she attributed this to the common phenomenon of people using outdated or flattering photos online and didn't immediately recognize it as a red flag indicating more serious deception. The man introduced himself, apologized for running late even though he was actually early, and suggested they sit in his truck and talk for a few minutes before going into the restaurant, a proposal that Ashley agreed to despite feeling some initial discomfort with the deviation from their planned public meeting. Once Ashley was in Trenton's truck, his demeanor changed dramatically from the friendly, slightly nervous persona he had presented moments before to something much more aggressive and controlling. He began driving away from the restaurant parking lot despite Ashley's protests and questions about where they were going, and when she demanded that he stop the vehicle and let her out, he refused and became verbally aggressive, telling her that she had led him on through their online conversations and that she owed him her time and attention. Ashley quickly realized she was in serious danger and attempted to call 911 on her cell phone, but Trenton grabbed the phone from her hand and threw it out the window while continuing to drive, taking them farther away from populated areas and into increasingly rural and isolated roads. Over the next several hours, Trenton subjected Ashley to a terrifying ordeal, driving to various locations while verbally abusing her, making threats about what he would do if she didn't comply with his demands, and eventually physically assaulting her when she continued to resist and demand to be released. The specific details of the assault were later documented through Ashley's testimony and physical evidence, but out of respect for her privacy and the traumatic nature of what she endured, what can be stated is that Trenton's attack was both sexually and physically violent, that it continued over an extended period, and that Ashley genuinely believed she might not survive the encounter. At a certain point, perhaps believing that Ashley was sufficiently cowed and would not attempt to escape, or simply distracted by his own actions, Trenton made a crucial error by stopping his truck near a wooded area and leaving Ashley alone in the vehicle for several minutes while he went to urinate. Seizing what might be her only opportunity to escape, Ashley managed to unlock the truck door despite her injuries and ran into the woods, moving as quickly as she could through unfamiliar terrain in the dark, driven by pure survival instinct and the knowledge that Trenton would almost certainly kill her if he caught her. She could hear him shouting and crashing through the brush behind her as he realized she had escaped and gave chase. But Ashley's fear gave her speed and determination, and she managed to reach a farmhouse where she pounded on the door screaming for help. The elderly couple who lived there immediately recognized that Ashley was in desperate trouble, let her inside, locked the doors, and called 911 while Ashley collapsed in their living room, traumatized, injured, and barely able to explain what had happened to her. Within minutes, sheriff's deputies from the county where the farmhouse was located arrived on scene, found Ashley in severe distress with visible injuries consistent with assault, and began securing the area and searching for her attacker. Ashley was able to provide enough information about Trenton's truck and physical appearance that deputies located the vehicle still parked near where she had escaped. But Trenton himself had fled into the woods and was not immediately apprehended. A large-scale search operation was launched involving multiple law enforcement agencies, K-9 units, and eventually a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment, all working to locate Trenton before he could escape the area or potentially harm anyone else. Ashley was transported to a hospital where she received treatment for her injuries and underwent a sexual assault examination that collected forensic evidence that would later be used to prosecute Trenton. Meanwhile, investigators began piecing together what had happened and who Ashley's attacker really was, discovering through the truck's registration that it belonged to David Trenton, running his name through criminal databases and discovering his extensive history of violence against women, and examining the Facebook profile he had used to contact Ashley and realizing it was completely fraudulent. Trenton was apprehended the following morning when he emerged from the woods and attempted to hitchhike on a rural highway, where he was spotted by a deputy who had been part of the search operation and arrested without incident. During initial interviews, Trenton attempted to claim that his encounter with Ashley had been consensual and that she had become angry and run away after an argument, a story that was immediately contradicted by the physical evidence, witness testimony, and the circumstances of his apprehension. He was charged with multiple felonies including kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and false imprisonment, charges that carried the potential for decades in prison if convicted. As investigators examined Trenton's background more thoroughly, they discovered evidence suggesting that Ashley was not his first victim. They found multiple fake Facebook profiles on devices seized from his residence, correspondence with other women who described experiences similar to what Ashley had endured though none had reported them to police, and circumstantial evidence linking him to at least 2 other unsolved assault cases in different counties. Several women came forward after his arrest to report that they had been contacted by someone matching Trenton's description using fake profiles, and that they had either met him and had disturbing experiences or had become suspicious and stopped communicating, potentially avoiding becoming victims themselves. The case proceeded to trial in 2015, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of Trenton's guilt, including Ashley's testimony about the attack, forensic evidence from the sexual assault examination, testimony from the couple who had helped Ashley escape, evidence from Trenton's truck and the crime scenes, and expert testimony about his pattern of creating fake online personas to target women. The defense attempted to argue that the sexual contact had been consensual and that the situation had escalated due to miscommunication and Ashley's alleged overreaction. But this narrative was thoroughly demolished by the physical evidence of violence, the circumstances of Ashley's escape and condition when she reached help, and testimony about Trenton's history of similar behavior with other women. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding David Trenton guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to 45 years in prison, ensuring that he would be elderly if he were ever released and would spend the majority of his remaining life incarcerated. Ashley Lindsay's survival and willingness to testify despite the trauma she had endured were crucial to securing Trenton's conviction and preventing him from victimizing other women, but the personal cost to her was immense. She struggled with PTSD, anxiety, and difficulty trusting others in the aftermath of the attack, required extensive therapy to process the trauma, and ultimately made the difficult decision to leave her teaching position and move to a different state to escape the memories and create a fresh start. Her case became an important example in law enforcement training about the dangers posed by predators who use fake social media profiles to target victims, and it highlighted the limitations of relying on social media platforms to verify the identities of users or screen out known dangerous individuals. Facebook and other social media companies have faced ongoing criticism for their failure to prevent the creation of fake profiles and their inconsistent enforcement of policies against impersonation and deceptive practices. Criticism that intensified after cases like Ashley's demonstrated the real-world consequences of these failures. The case also illustrated how predators specifically target individuals they perceive as isolated or vulnerable based on information gleaned from social media activity, and how the same digital tools that can facilitate genuine human connection can be weaponized by those seeking to exploit, manipulate, and harm others. Ashley has spoken publicly about her experience in limited contexts, working with victim advocacy organizations to educate others about the warning signs of online predators and the importance of trusting instincts when something feels wrong about an online interaction, emphasizing that even when someone has invested time and emotional energy into an online relationship, safety must always take precedence over politeness or fear of overreacting. Her message to other potential victims is clear. If an online relationship involves someone who seems reluctant to video chat, whose photos don't match their appearance in person, who suggests meeting in isolated locations rather than public spaces, who attempts to move the relationship forward very quickly, or who makes you feel uncomfortable or pressured in any way, these are serious red flags that should not be ignored. As of 2025, David Trenton remains incarcerated and has been denied parole on multiple occasions due to the severity of his crimes and his assessed risk of reoffending, with corrections officials and psychologists who have evaluated him concluding that he continues to exhibit the patterns of thinking and behavior that make him dangerous to women. Ashley has rebuilt her life in a new location, eventually returning to teaching in a different capacity and finding ways to channel her experience into helping others. though she continues to deal with the psychological aftermath of the trauma she endured. Her case stands as a powerful reminder that online deception can have devastating real-world consequences, that predators are skilled at identifying and exploiting vulnerable targets, and that the platforms that facilitate online connections must do more to protect users from those who would abuse these systems to cause harm. Number 6. Tina Stewart. The Plenty of Fish predator Tina Stewart was a 51-year-old recently divorced woman living in Jacksonville, Florida, working as an administrative assistant at a medical office and trying to rebuild her life after the end of a 25-year marriage that had dissolved due to her ex-husband's infidelity and emotional abuse. Tina had spent most of her adult life as a wife and mother, raising 2 children who were now adults living independently, and she found herself at a crossroads where she needed to rediscover her own identity and interests separate from the roles she had occupied for decades. Friends encouraged her to try online dating as a way to meet new people and potentially find companionship, though Tina was hesitant and somewhat intimidated by the prospect of navigating the digital dating world, which seemed foreign and complicated to someone who had been in a relationship since before the internet became a ubiquitous part of daily life. Nevertheless, in the summer of 2015, Tina created a profile on Plenty of Fish, one of the most popular free dating websites, choosing that platform because it seemed accessible and because several of her friends had used it successfully. Her profile was straightforward and honest, describing herself as a woman starting over after a long marriage, interested in meeting someone kind and stable for friendship that might develop into something more, and she included recent photos that accurately represented her appearance. Tina received numerous messages from men on the platform, many of which she found off-putting due to their overtly sexual nature or their aggressive tone, but among the contacts was someone named Robert who seemed different, polite, respectful, age-appropriate at 54 according to his profile, and genuinely interested in getting to know her as a person rather than just seeking immediate physical intimacy. Robert's profile presented him as a widower who had lost his wife to cancer several years earlier, a retired military veteran receiving disability benefits, and someone looking for a companion to share simple pleasures like cooking at home, watching movies, and enjoying Florida's beaches and natural areas. His messages to Tina were thoughtful and patient, asking about her interests, her children, and her experiences, never pushing for personal information or rushing to meet in person. A measured approach that Tina found reassuring and that contrasted with the more aggressive tactics employed by many other men who had contacted her. Over the course of several weeks in August and September 2015, Tina and Robert developed what she believed was a genuine friendship through their online communications, sharing details about their lives, their past relationships, their regrets and hopes, and gradually building trust and emotional intimacy. Robert shared what appeared to be authentic struggles with adjusting to life as a widower, dealing with health issues related to his military service, and managing the loneliness that came with aging without a partner, all of which resonated with Tina's own experiences of loss, transition, and isolation. What Tina didn't know, because the Plenty of Fish platform did not conduct background checks or verify the information users provided about themselves, was that Robert was actually Gerald Patterson, a 58-year-old man with a lengthy criminal history that included multiple domestic violence convictions, aggravated assault, violation of restraining orders, and most disturbingly, a previous manslaughter conviction from the 1980s in which he had killed a girlfriend during a violent altercation, served 12 years in prison, and been released on parole. Patterson had a documented pattern of targeting women through personal ads and later through online dating platforms, entering into relationships characterized by escalating control, possessiveness, and violence, and then either being arrested when victims reported him or moving to different locations when relationships ended. Since his release from prison in the mid-1990s, Patterson had been arrested at least 6 times for offenses related to domestic violence against different women, though many of these cases had been plea bargained down to lesser charges or resulted in relatively light sentences, allowing him to remain free and continue the pattern. His use of dating websites appeared to be a deliberate strategy for meeting women who might not know about his past and who could be more easily isolated and controlled than women he might meet through social circles where his reputation and history would be known. The false identity he presented to Tina, the widower, veteran, gentle soul seeking companionship, was carefully constructed to appeal to women in her demographic and situation, and it had apparently worked multiple times before with other victims. After nearly 2 months of online communication, Robert suggested to Tina that they should finally meet in person, proposing that she come to his apartment for dinner since he enjoyed cooking and wanted to prepare a special meal for her, presenting this as a romantic gesture rather than the red flag it actually represented. Tina was uncertain about meeting at his home for their first in-person encounter, as she had read advice suggesting first dates should always occur in public places, but Robert was persuasive, arguing that at their age and given how well they knew each other from their extensive conversations, the traditional caution about first dates was unnecessary and almost insulting to the connection they had built. He also claimed that his health issues made it difficult for him to spend long periods in public places due to pain and fatigue, and that he would be more comfortable and able to focus on her if they met in private, arguments that appealed to Tina's compassionate nature and her desire not to seem suspicious or unkind. Against her better judgment and despite some lingering concerns, Tina agreed to meet Robert at his apartment on the evening of October 3, 2015. She told her adult daughter about her plans, providing Robert's address and first name, and promised to check in by phone later that evening. Basic safety precautions that would prove crucial to the investigation that followed. Tina drove to the address Robert had provided, a small apartment complex in a somewhat rundown area of Jacksonville, and was greeted at the door by a man who generally matched the photos she had seen online, though he appeared older and less healthy than she had expected. Robert welcomed her into his apartment, which was modestly furnished and showed some signs of the home-cooked meal he had promised to prepare, and initially the visit seemed to proceed normally, with casual conversation and Robert offering Tina a glass of wine while he finished preparing dinner. However, as the evening progressed, Tina began to notice concerning changes in Robert's behavior. He became increasingly possessive and familiar in his physical contact, touching her in ways that felt presumptuous given that they had just met in person, making comments about her appearance and body that were sexual in nature and made her uncomfortable, and showing signs of irritation when she gently tried to establish boundaries or redirect the conversation. When Tina attempted to excuse herself to use the bathroom and check her phone to send the promised message to her daughter, Robert became agitated and confrontational, demanding to know who she was planning to contact and accusing her of not being truly interested in him, a reaction that was both disproportionate to the situation and frightening in its intensity. Tina's instincts told her that she needed to leave immediately, and she attempted to gather her belongings and move toward the door while making excuses about not feeling well and needing to go home. But Robert blocked her path and became physically aggressive, grabbing her arm hard enough to cause pain and telling her in no uncertain terms that she wasn't leaving until he decided their date was over. What followed was a violent assault in which Patterson attacked Tina both physically and sexually, an attack that lasted for several hours and left Tina severely traumatized and injured. At some point during the assault, Tina lost consciousness, and when she regained awareness, she found herself alone in the apartment, with Patterson apparently having left the residence. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had just endured, Tina had the presence of mind to locate her phone, which Patterson had taken from her but left in the apartment, and she called 911, providing the address and telling the dispatcher that she had been attacked. Jacksonville police and emergency medical services arrived within minutes, finding Tina in severe distress with visible injuries consistent with assault. She was transported to a hospital where she received emergency treatment and underwent a sexual assault examination that collected crucial forensic evidence. Meanwhile, police secured Patterson's apartment as a crime scene and began the process of identifying and locating him. When officers ran the name Robert associated with the address, they discovered it was an alias and that the apartment was actually rented to Gerald Patterson. And when they ran his name through criminal databases, his extensive violent history was immediately apparent. A warrant was issued for Patterson's arrest on charges including sexual battery, aggravated battery, kidnapping, and false imprisonment, and a search of the apartment yielded additional evidence including Tina's belongings, biological evidence, and materials suggesting Patterson had been in contact with multiple other women through dating websites. Patterson was apprehended the following day when he returned to the apartment complex, apparently believing that Tina would not report the assault or that he had time to retrieve belongings and flee. During questioning, he provided inconsistent accounts of what had occurred, at various times claiming that Tina had consented to sexual contact and then changed her mind afterward, that she had attempted to rob him and he had acted in self-defense, and that he didn't remember what had happened due to intoxication, none of which were consistent with the physical evidence or Tina's detailed account. As prosecutors built their case against Patterson, they discovered that he had active profiles on multiple dating websites under different names and that several women had reported disturbing experiences with someone matching his description, though many of these reports had not been thoroughly investigated or connected to Patterson specifically. The case went to trial in 2016, with Tina providing powerful and detailed testimony about the attack despite the emotional difficulty of recounting the experience in a public courtroom. The prosecution presented forensic evidence from the sexual assault examination that confirmed Tina's account, medical records documenting her injuries, testimony from the 911 dispatcher and first responders about Tina's condition when help arrived, and Patterson's own criminal history demonstrating a clear pattern of violence against women. The defense attempted to argue consent and suggested that Tina had voluntarily engaged in rough sexual activity and then regretted it afterward, but this narrative was completely undermined by the severity of her injuries, the evidence of restraint and force, and her immediate report to law enforcement. The jury found Gerald Patterson guilty on all counts, and given his extensive criminal history and the particularly violent nature of the current offenses, the judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence for a man already in his late 50s. The case of Tina Stewart highlighted multiple systemic failures that allowed Patterson to victimize women repeatedly over decades. The criminal justice system's inadequate response to domestic violence that resulted in light sentences and frequent releases despite clear evidence of ongoing danger. The failure of dating platforms to implement even basic screening measures that might have flagged someone with Patterson's history, and the lack of a centralized system for tracking and preventing online predators who move between platforms and jurisdictions. Tina's experience sparked discussions in Florida and nationally about whether dating websites should be required to conduct criminal background checks on users and disclose to potential matches when someone has a history of violent crimes, particularly crimes against intimate partners or dating partners. The dating industry has generally opposed such requirements, citing concerns about privacy, the potential for false positives, the expense of implementation, and questions about legal liability, though critics argue these concerns pale in comparison to the documented harm caused by allowing violent offenders unfettered access to platforms designed to facilitate intimate connections. Tina struggled with PTSD and trust issues following the assault and went through extensive therapy to process the trauma and regain her sense of safety and autonomy. She eventually became an advocate for stronger regulations of online dating platforms and for better training of law enforcement in recognizing and investigating crimes that originate in online spaces, sharing her story publicly to raise awareness and potentially prevent others from experiencing similar harm. The case also illustrated the particular vulnerability of individuals returning to dating after long marriages or periods of being single, who may be less familiar with contemporary dating norms and technologies and more susceptible to manipulation by skilled predators who understand how to identify and exploit such vulnerabilities. As of 2025, Gerald Patterson remains incarcerated in Florida State Prison, and due to his age and the length of his sentence, he is unlikely ever to be released. Tina has rebuilt her life and found ways to channel her experience into helping others, working with victims' advocacy organizations and speaking about online safety, though she continues to deal with the psychological aftermath of the trauma. Her case remains an important reference point in discussions about the responsibility of dating platforms to protect their users and the need for more comprehensive approaches to preventing violence against women in all contexts, including the increasingly digitized sphere of romantic and social connections. Number 7. Laura Peterson. The Bumble date murder-for-hire plot. Laura Peterson was a 35-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative living in Denver, Colorado, successful in her career, financially independent, and enjoying an active lifestyle that included skiing, hiking, and participation in local running clubs. Laura had been married in her 20s but divorced amicably several years earlier, and she had spent the intervening time focusing on her professional development and building a strong network of friends while remaining open to the possibility of finding a partner with whom she could build a meaningful long-term relationship. In early 2016, Laura joined Bumble, a dating app that differentiated itself from competitors by requiring women to make the first contact with matches, a feature that appealed to Laura's independent personality and her desire to have more control over her dating experiences. She approached the app thoughtfully, crafting a profile that represented her interests and values honestly, and being selective about whom she matched with and initiated conversations with, looking for men who seemed mature, professionally established, and interested in serious relationships rather than casual encounters. Among her matches in the spring of 2016 was someone named Scott, whose profile indicated he was a 38-year-old entrepreneur running a tech startup, physically fit and active, interested in many of the same outdoor activities Laura enjoyed, and looking for a relationship with an independent, ambitious woman. Their initial conversations on the app were engaging and intellectually stimulating, covering topics ranging from their respective careers and the challenges of entrepreneurship and sales to their outdoor adventures and travel experiences. Scott seemed charming, successful, and compatible with Laura's lifestyle and goals, and after several weeks of messaging on the app and transitioning to text messages, they agreed to meet in person for a hike followed by lunch at a popular restaurant in the foothills outside Denver, a date that combined Laura's love of outdoor activity with the safety of meeting in a public area with other people around. The date in May 2016 went well from Laura's perspective, with Scott appearing to be who he had represented himself as online: attractive, fit, knowledgeable about hiking and the local trails, engaging in conversation, and seemingly genuinely interested in her. They agreed to see each other again, and over the following weeks, Laura and Scott went on several more dates, gradually building what Laura believed was a promising relationship with someone who shared her values and interests. Scott claimed to be in the process of securing venture capital funding for his startup and frequently discussed his business plans and the stress of entrepreneurship, topics that Laura could relate to given the pressures of her own competitive sales career. What Laura didn't know was that Scott was actually Scott Kimball, a 41-year-old con artist and career criminal with a history that included fraud, embezzlement, and most disturbingly, suspected involvement in several murders, though he had never been successfully prosecuted for homicide. Kimball had at various points in his criminal career worked as an informant for law enforcement agencies, a role that had given him insight into investigative techniques and had also provided him with a degree of protection from prosecution for some of his activities. He was skilled at creating false identities, fabricating professional credentials, and manipulating people for financial gain, and his supposed tech startup was entirely fictional, part of an elaborate con designed to establish credibility and gain the trust of potential victims. Kimball's actual situation was far from the successful entrepreneur image he projected. He was deeply in debt, facing potential criminal charges for fraud in another state, and desperately seeking money through any means available, including elaborate scams targeting wealthy or financially stable individuals. As Laura and Scott's relationship progressed through the summer of 2016, he began to share information with her about his supposed business challenges, explaining that his funding had been delayed and that he was experiencing temporary cash flow problems that were threatening to derail his company's growth at a critical moment. Laura, who was generous by nature and had come to care for Scott, offered to help with small loans, assistance that Scott accepted gratefully while promising to repay her as soon as his funding came through. Over several months, these small loans escalated into larger amounts, with Laura eventually lending Scott nearly $70,000. Money that she had saved diligently through her successful sales career and that represented a significant portion of her assets. Scott continued to provide elaborate explanations for why the promised funding kept being delayed and why he couldn't yet repay Laura, and he began to shift the nature of their relationship from romantic partnership to something more transactional, becoming distant and less affectionate even as he continued to request financial assistance. By early 2017, Laura had become suspicious of Scott's stories and increasingly insistent about seeing documentation of his business and getting a clear repayment plan, requests that Scott deflected and evaded. When Laura finally demanded concrete proof of his business's existence and threatened to take legal action to recover her money, Scott's behavior became erratic and concerning, with him making vague threats about what might happen if she caused problems for him and suggesting that she didn't understand the dangerous people he was involved with through his business dealings. Frightened by these threats but also angry about being deceived and determined to recover her money, Laura consulted with an attorney about her options for pursuing Scott legally and also confided in close friends about the situation, expressing fear that Scott might become violent if she pushed too hard for repayment, but also feeling unable to simply abandon such a large sum of money. What Laura didn't know was that Scott Kimball, faced with the prospect of Laura exposing his fraud and potentially triggering a deeper investigation into his activities, had begun to plot even more drastic measures to eliminate the problem she represented. In March 2017, Kimball contacted an associate from his criminal past, offering him money to kill Laura Peterson and make it appear to be a random act of violence or a robbery gone wrong, a murder-for-hire plot that he believed would eliminate the witness to his fraud and allow him to escape consequences. Unbeknownst to Kimball, The person he approached about murdering Laura was actually cooperating with law enforcement in an unrelated investigation and immediately reported Kimball's solicitation to authorities. The FBI and Denver Police Department initiated an undercover operation in which an agent posed as a hitman willing to carry out the murder, meeting with Kimball to discuss the details of the plot, the payment arrangement, and the specific methods to be used. These conversations were recorded, capturing Kimball discussing how he wanted Laura killed, when and where the murder should occur, and what he was willing to pay for the service, evidence that would prove crucial in prosecuting him. Throughout these recorded conversations, Kimball showed no remorse or hesitation about ordering Laura's murder, discussing her death in cold, transactional terms and focusing primarily on ensuring that the killing couldn't be traced back to him. Law enforcement allowed the undercover operation to proceed to the point where they had irrefutable evidence of Kimball's intent and planning, then arrested him before any actual harm could come to Laura. At the time of his arrest, Kimball was in possession of detailed information about Laura's daily routine, her home and work addresses, her vehicle, and her typical travel patterns, information he had gathered during their relationship and provided to the supposed hitman to facilitate the murder. Laura was informed by law enforcement about the plot against her life, a revelation that was both terrifying and traumatizing, as she realized that someone she had trusted and cared for had been planning to have her killed simply to avoid repaying money and being held accountable for fraud. The case expanded beyond the murder-for-hire charges as investigators began examining Kimball's background more thoroughly and discovered connections to several unsolved murders and disappearances spanning multiple states and many years. While building the case around the plot to kill Laura, prosecutors uncovered evidence suggesting Kimball's involvement in the deaths of at least 4 other people, including a former girlfriend and several individuals he had been associated with in various criminal enterprises. Though these investigations were complicated by the passage of time and the difficulty of connecting Kimball definitively to crimes that had occurred years earlier, the murder-for-hire case went to trial in 2018, with prosecutors presenting the recorded conversations between Kimball and the undercover agent, testimony from the cooperating witness who had initially reported Kimball's solicitation, evidence of Kimball's extensive criminal history and pattern of violence, and testimony from Laura about her relationship with Kimball and his escalating threats. The evidence was overwhelming and indisputable, with Kimball's own voice clearly captured on recordings discussing the murder in detail, and the jury had little difficulty finding him guilty of solicitation of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and numerous other charges. Given the severity of his crimes and his demonstrated danger to others, Kimball was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case of Laura Peterson exposed the extreme dangers that can lurk behind attractive dating profiles and romantic relationships that begin online, demonstrating that the risks extend beyond sexual assault or financial fraud to potentially include murder when victims threaten to expose perpetrators or hold them accountable. Laura's experience highlighted the particular vulnerability of successful, financially stable individuals who become targets for predators seeking money, and it illustrated how emotional manipulation and the gradual building of trust can lead intelligent, cautious people to make financial and personal decisions they would never have made absent the deceptive relationship. The case also raised questions about whether dating platforms have any responsibility to screen users for serious criminal histories, particularly violent felonies, and whether users have a right to know if someone they're communicating with has been convicted of crimes that would be relevant to the decision of whether to meet them or trust them. Bumble and other dating platforms generally argue that they cannot be expected to conduct comprehensive background checks on millions of users, and that such screening might create a false sense of security while being easily circumvented by determined criminals using false identities, though critics counter that some level of screening is better than none and that platforms have both a moral and potentially legal responsibility to implement reasonable safety measures. Laura underwent extensive therapy to process the trauma of learning that someone she had cared for had been planning to murder her, and she struggled with trust issues and fear that persisted long after Kimball was safely incarcerated. She eventually became an advocate for stronger consumer protections in the online dating industry and for better education about the warning signs of romance scams and manipulative relationships, sharing her story publicly to help others recognize similar patterns before they reach such extreme outcomes. The case received significant media coverage and has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries as an example of how online dating can be exploited not just for minor scams or assaults, but for potentially lethal purposes when perpetrators view their victims solely as obstacles to be eliminated. As of 2025, Scott Kimball remains in federal prison, and investigators continue to examine cold cases in multiple states where he lived and operated, believing that Laura was fortunate to have survived an encounter with someone who likely killed others who got in the way of his criminal enterprises. Laura has rebuilt her life and returned to a modified version of her active lifestyle, though she has remained cautious about online dating and romantic relationships, understandably wary after her brush with someone who valued her life so little that he was willing to pay to have her murdered simply to avoid consequences for his own criminal behavior. Number 8. Caitlin Miller. The Hinge date disappearance. Caitlin Miller was a 26-year-old graduate student pursuing a master's degree in environmental science at the University of Oregon in Eugene, working toward a career in conservation biology and spending much of her time either in classes, conducting field research, or working as a teaching assistant to support herself through her program. Caitlin was described by friends and family as passionate about environmental causes, intellectually curious, socially conscious, and someone who approached life with optimism and a genuine belief in the goodness of people. She had been in several serious relationships during her undergraduate and early graduate school years, but had been single for about 8 months as of the fall of 2017, focusing primarily on her demanding academic work while remaining open to meeting someone compatible with her values and lifestyle. At the encouragement of friends who had found the app useful for meeting people in Eugene's relatively small dating pool, Caitlin downloaded Hinge in September 2017, attracted by the app's marketing emphasis on facilitating meaningful connections rather than casual hookups, and by its interface that encouraged users to engage with specific elements of potential matches' profiles rather than just swiping based on photos. Caitlin's profile reflected her authentic self, photos from her field research showing her enthusiasm for outdoor work, prompts filled with references to environmental issues and scientific interests, and clear statements about seeking someone who shared her progressive values and passion for making a positive impact. Among the men who contacted Caitlin through Hinge was someone named Michael, whose profile suggested he was a 29-year-old outdoor educator working for a wilderness program that took at-risk youth on therapeutic camping trips, a profession that aligned perfectly with Caitlin's interests and values. Michael's profile included photos of him in outdoor settings with groups of young people, discussed his belief in using nature as a healing tool, and referenced environmental conservation as a personal priority, creating an image of someone who would be highly compatible with Caitlin's worldview and career path. Their initial conversations on Hinge were substantive and engaging, discussing topics like climate change, conservation strategies, education approaches for environmental literacy, and their shared experiences in Oregon's natural areas. Caitlin felt she had found someone who not only understood her passion for environmental work but shared it at a level she rarely encountered, and she was excited about the possibility of building a relationship with someone whose values and interests aligned so closely with her own. After several weeks of messaging on the app and transitioning to text messages, Michael suggested they meet for a hike followed by lunch, proposing a moderately popular trail in the mountains outside Eugene where Caitlin had hiked before and felt comfortable. The date was set for November 4, 2017, a Saturday when Caitlin had no academic commitments and Michael claimed to have a rare day off from his work with the wilderness program. Caitlin told her roommate about her plans, sharing Michael's name and the general location where they would be hiking, and she posted on social media that she was looking forward to getting out into nature for a hiking date, messages that would later help investigators piece together her last known activities. On the morning of November 4th, Caitlin drove to the trailhead where she had arranged to meet Michael, arriving at the designated time and seeing a man who generally matched the photos from his Hinge profile waiting in the parking area. They greeted each other, and according to surveillance footage from a nearby visitor center, they were seen together walking toward the trailhead around 9:30 a.m., appearing to be engaged in friendly conversation. This was the last confirmed sighting of Caitlin Miller alive. When Caitlin failed to return home that evening and didn't respond to messages from her roommate, concern began to mount, as it was completely out of character for Caitlin to be unreachable or to miss scheduled commitments without communication. Her roommate contacted Caitlin's parents, who immediately drove to Eugene and worked with university police and local law enforcement to file a missing person report. Investigators quickly learned about Caitlin's planned hiking date and began attempting to identify and locate the man she had been meeting, discovering from her Hinge messages that his name was supposedly Michael and that he claimed to work for a wilderness education program. When police contacted local wilderness programs to inquire about employees named Michael matching the description Caitlin had provided, they found that no such person worked for any of the legitimate organizations in the area, raising the disturbing possibility that Caitlin had been meeting someone using a false identity. A search of the trail where Caitlin and her date were last seen was launched immediately, with search and rescue teams, K-9 units, and volunteers combing the area for any sign of Caitlin or evidence of what might have happened to her. Searchers found Caitlin's car still parked at the trailhead, with her purse inside but her phone, keys, and backpack missing, suggesting she had taken them with her on the hike. On the trail itself, several miles from the trailhead in a relatively isolated area, searchers discovered Caitlin's backpack partially hidden in vegetation off the main path, containing her water bottle, wallet, and some personal items but not her phone. The discovery of the backpack intensified fears that something terrible had happened to Caitlin, and the search operation expanded to include helicopters with thermal imaging, additional ground teams, and specialized personnel trained in recovering individuals from difficult terrain. Despite extensive searching over several days, no additional evidence of Caitlin's whereabouts was found, and the case transitioned from a search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation focused on identifying the man Caitlin had been with and determining what had happened on that trail. Investigators worked with Hinge to obtain information about the profile that had contacted Caitlin, discovering that it had been created with what appeared to be stolen photos. Images taken from a real outdoor educator's social media account without his knowledge or permission, and that the account had been inactive since shortly after Caitlin's disappearance, suggesting the perpetrator had deleted or abandoned it once the crime occurred. The email address used to create the account was traced to a public library computer in a different Oregon city, providing no useful information about the user's identity. Phone records showed that Caitlin's phone had stopped transmitting data around midday on November 4th, suggesting it had either been turned off, destroyed, or moved to an area without coverage, though the last known location it had pinged from was consistent with the area where her backpack was found. As weeks passed without any sign of Caitlin, investigators began examining similar cases in Oregon and neighboring states, looking for patterns that might connect to her disappearance or indicate a serial offender operating in the region. They discovered several unsolved cases of women who had disappeared after going on dates with men they had met through dating apps, though the lack of surviving witnesses or definitive evidence made it difficult to determine whether these cases were connected or the work of the same perpetrator. Caitlin's family mounted an extensive public awareness campaign, distributing missing person flyers throughout Oregon, organizing volunteer search efforts, and maintaining active social media presence to keep attention on her case and generate leads. They also worked with victims' advocacy organizations to push for stronger safety measures on dating apps and for better law enforcement protocols for investigating crimes that originate in digital spaces. Despite these efforts and ongoing investigative work, Caitlin's case remained unsolved, with no body recovered and no suspect identified. The lack of closure was devastating for her family, who found themselves in the agonizing position of not knowing what had happened to their daughter and being unable to properly mourn or achieve any sense of justice. The environmental science program at the University of Oregon held memorial services for Caitlin, with professors and fellow students sharing memories of her enthusiasm, her dedication to conservation work, and her plans to make a meaningful contribution to addressing climate change and protecting ecosystems, potential that was stolen when she disappeared. Caitlin's case became part of a growing number of unsolved disappearances connected to online dating, cases that highlight the particular investigative challenges posed by perpetrators who use fake identities and digital platforms to identify and access victims. Without physical evidence, witnesses beyond the initial meeting point, or any way to definitively identify the person Caitlin had been with, investigators found it extremely difficult to develop leads or make progress on the case. The investigation remained open and active, with periodic reviews of the evidence and follow-up on tips from the public. But as years passed without breakthrough, the likelihood of solving the case or recovering Caitlin diminished. The tragedy of Caitlin's disappearance illustrated how carefully constructed fake profiles that appeal to specific interests and values can be used to target victims who might otherwise be cautious. With Caitlin having been attracted to Michael, specifically because his supposed profession and environmental commitment aligned so perfectly with her own passions, making him seem uniquely trustworthy when he may have been deliberately crafting that persona to appeal to women like her. The case raised questions about what more dating platforms could do to prevent such tragedies, with critics arguing that Hinge's verification processes were clearly inadequate if someone could create a completely false profile using stolen photos and fabricated biographical information, and use that profile to lure a victim to her likely death. Hinge and other dating apps have gradually implemented some enhanced verification features in the years since Caitlin's disappearance, including optional photo verification that requires users to submit real-time selfies that are matched to their profile photos. Though these features are often optional rather than mandatory and can still be circumvented by determined offenders, the environmental conservation community that Caitlin had been part of established a scholarship in her name for students pursuing graduate work in conservation biology, ensuring that her memory would be associated with the positive impact she hoped to make rather than solely with the tragedy of her disappearance. Her family continues to advocate for her case, working with law enforcement to review new leads and technologies that might help solve cold cases, and maintaining hope that someday they will learn what happened to Caitlin and be able to achieve some measure of closure and justice. As of 2025, Caitlin Miller's case remains unsolved, and she is still listed as a missing person, with investigators continuing to follow up on occasional tips and reviewing the case file for any overlooked evidence or new investigative approaches that might provide answers. Her disappearance stands as a haunting reminder that even when individuals take reasonable precautions, meeting in public areas, informing others of their plans, choosing popular hiking trails rather than isolated locations, they can still become victims when they encounter predators who are skilled at deception and willing to use violence. The fact that Caitlin's case remains unsolved also highlights the investigative challenges posed by crimes that occur in isolated natural areas where physical evidence may be scattered, degraded, or never found, and where the absence of witnesses or surveillance makes it extremely difficult to establish what occurred or to identify suspects. Caitlin's story is frequently referenced by safety advocates who emphasize the importance of video chatting with potential dates before meeting in person to verify that they match their photos and appear to be who they claim to be. Meeting for initial dates in busy public places rather than isolated locations regardless of the activity planned, and maintaining regular communication with trusted individuals throughout dates so that someone knows your status and location. Despite these precautions potentially reducing risk, Caitlin's case demonstrates that determined predators can still find opportunities to harm others, and that the ultimate responsibility for violence rests with perpetrators rather than victims who may have made reasonable decisions that nevertheless resulted in tragic outcomes. The unresolved nature of Caitlin's disappearance continues to haunt her family, friends, and community, all of whom are left without answers about what happened to a vibrant young woman whose life was just beginning and whose contributions to environmental conservation were cut short by someone who saw her only as a target to be exploited and destroyed. Number 9. Cristina Ferreira. The deadly first date. Cristina Ferreira was a 42-year-old single mother and high school mathematics teacher living in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, known to her colleagues as an excellent educator who had a gift for making complex mathematical concepts accessible to struggling students and for creating a classroom environment where all students felt supported and capable of success. Cristina had been divorced for nearly a decade, raising her teenage son primarily on her own while maintaining a demanding career, and she had dated only sporadically during those years, prioritizing her child's stability and her professional responsibilities over her personal romantic life. By 2018, with her son becoming more independent as he prepared for college and with some encouragement from friends who worried that she was becoming isolated, Cristina decided to try online dating again, joining Match.com because she preferred platforms that required paid subscriptions, believing that paying customers would be more serious about finding genuine relationships than users of free apps. Her profile was honest about her situation: a working single mother, looking for companionship with someone who understood the demands of parenting and professional life, interested in simple pleasures like trying new restaurants, attending local theater productions, and hiking in Arizona's beautiful desert landscapes. Cristina received interest from various men, and she proceeded cautiously, exchanging messages at length before agreeing to meet anyone in person and conducting basic online searches to verify that potential dates were who they claimed to be. Among the men who contacted Cristina was someone named David, whose profile indicated he was a 45-year-old accountant, divorced with grown children, financially stable, and looking for a serious relationship with an educated, independent woman. David's messages to Cristina were respectful, patient, and thoughtful, discussing their shared experiences of divorce and single parenthood. asking about her teaching career, and sharing what appeared to be genuine details about his own life and interests. Over several weeks in January and February 2018, they built what Christina believed was a solid foundation of communication and mutual understanding, with David presenting himself as a stable, normal, somewhat boring professional, exactly the kind of reliable partner Christina thought she might be looking for at this stage in her life. They eventually agreed to meet for dinner at a mid-scale restaurant in Scottsdale on the evening of February 24, 2018, a Saturday when Christina's son was spending the weekend with his father, giving her the rare freedom to focus on adult social activities. Christina told several people about her planned date, including her ex-husband who was caring for their son that weekend, her sister, and 2 close friends from work, providing them with David's name and general information from his Match.com profile, safety precautions that demonstrated her awareness of the potential risks of meeting strangers from online dating. What Christina didn't know, because Match.com screening processes were minimal, and because David had used just enough accurate information to create a believable profile while omitting crucial details about his past, was that David was actually David Harris, a man with a criminal history that included stalking, harassment, and a previous arrest for assault against a former girlfriend, charges that had been reduced through plea bargaining to a misdemeanor that wouldn't necessarily appear in basic background checks. Harris also had documented mental health issues including paranoid personality traits and a history of becoming irrationally jealous and possessive in romantic relationships, patterns that had led multiple former partners to obtain restraining orders against him. Since his last arrest in 2015, Harris had been somewhat more successful at hiding his dangerous tendencies, at least in the initial stages of relationships, having learned to present a more normal facade during early interactions while the same troubling patterns of control and paranoia remained dormant just beneath the surface, ready to emerge once he felt secure in a relationship or faced rejection. On the evening of February 24th, Christina arrived at the designated restaurant to meet David, and according to restaurant staff and surveillance footage, they were seated at a table and appeared to be having a normal conversation over dinner for approximately 90 minutes. Witnesses later reported that nothing about their interaction seemed concerning or unusual, with both appearing engaged in conversation and exhibiting the slightly awkward but friendly demeanor typical of first dates between people who have only communicated online. After finishing dinner, Christina and David left the restaurant together around 8:45 p.m., with surveillance footage showing them walking toward the parking lot in apparently amicable conversation. What happened next remains partially reconstructed from physical evidence and forensic analysis, as there were no direct witnesses to the events that followed, but investigators believe that in the parking lot, Harris made some kind of advance toward Christina, possibly attempting to kiss her or suggesting they extend the date by going somewhere else together, and Christina politely declined, indicating she had enjoyed meeting him but wanted to end the evening and drive home separately. For most people, such a response would be a mild disappointment but nothing more. But for David Harris, whose fragile ego and paranoid mindset predisposed him to interpret rejection as a profound insult and threat, Christina's polite refusal triggered an immediate and violent rage. Security cameras captured the beginning of what happened next. Harris grabbing Christina's arm as she walked toward her car, Christina pulling away and appearing to speak firmly to him, Harris pursuing her, and then the two of them moving beyond the range of cameras toward a more isolated area of the parking lot where Christina had parked. What occurred in that location was a vicious attack in which Harris struck Christina repeatedly in the head with a blunt object, later determined to be a tire iron from his vehicle, causing severe traumatic injuries. The attack was brief but extremely violent, and Christina likely lost consciousness quickly, though the full extent of the assault continued even after she was incapacitated. After killing Christina, Harris apparently panicked, dragging her body further back in the parking lot, behind some landscaping, where it would not be immediately visible from the restaurant or parking lot entrance, then fleeing the scene in his vehicle. Christina's body was discovered approximately 2 hours later when a restaurant employee taking out trash noticed what appeared to be someone lying on the ground in the back area of the parking lot. Emergency services were called, but Christina was obviously deceased, and the scene was immediately treated as a homicide. Scottsdale police detectives began the investigation by reviewing security footage from the restaurant and parking lot, quickly identifying that Christina had been on a date with a man and that the two had left together. Christina's phone, which was found near her body, provided access to her recent communications including her Match.com messages with David, giving investigators his supposed identity and profile information. When they attempted to contact Harris through the information he had provided on Match.com, they discovered that his address was false and his phone number had been disconnected, indicating an attempt to avoid being traced. However, Harris had made a crucial mistake. He had used his own credit card to pay for dinner at the restaurant, providing investigators with his real name and financial information that allowed them to identify him definitively and obtain his actual address and vehicle information. A warrant was immediately issued for Harris's arrest on charges of first-degree murder, and law enforcement began searching for him, discovering that he had abandoned his apartment and appeared to be fleeing. An alert was issued to law enforcement agencies throughout Arizona and neighboring states, and Harris's photo and vehicle description were distributed to the media, generating numerous tips from the public. Harris was apprehended less than 48 hours after Christina's murder when he was stopped at a Border Patrol checkpoint while attempting to enter Mexico, where he apparently believed he could avoid prosecution. He was taken into custody without incident and extradited back to Arizona to face murder charges. During interrogation, Harris initially claimed that he and Christina had been attacked by a third party in the parking lot and that he had fled in panic, a story that was immediately contradicted by the surveillance footage showing that no one else had been present. When confronted with the evidence, Harris changed his account, claiming that Christina had attacked him first and that he had acted in self-defense, an explanation that was completely inconsistent with the forensic evidence showing that Christina had been struck repeatedly from behind and above, indicating an attack rather than a defensive struggle. The case proceeded to trial in 2019, with prosecutors presenting a straightforward narrative supported by overwhelming physical and digital evidence. Harris had become enraged when Christina rejected his advances, had attacked her in the parking lot with extreme violence, and had then fled while attempting to avoid identification and arrest. The evidence included surveillance footage of Christina and Harris together, testimony from restaurant staff about their dinner, forensic analysis of the crime scene and Christina's injuries, Harris's own credit card records placing him at the scene, and testimony about his history of violence toward women and inability to handle rejection. The defense attempted to argue that Harris had not intended to kill Christina and that her death had been the result of an altercation that had escalated beyond what he had planned, suggesting a lesser charge of second-degree murder or manslaughter. But the severity of the attack and the repeated blows struck after Christina was already incapacitated contradicted any narrative of unintentional killing. Expert testimony established that Harris had continued striking Christina even after injuries that would have been obviously incapacitating, demonstrating a level of rage and intent to harm that went far beyond any reasonable response to perceived rejection. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding David Harris guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christina Ferreira's murder devastated her family, particularly her teenage son who lost his mother just as he was preparing to transition to college and adulthood, a loss that would affect his development and future in immeasurable ways. The high school where Christina had taught for over 15 years held memorial services honoring her dedication to students and her impact on countless young people who had struggled with mathematics until Christina's patient teaching helped them achieve success. Her colleagues and former students established a scholarship fund in her name to support aspiring teachers, ensuring that her legacy of educational excellence and student advocacy would continue. The case highlighted how even brief encounters through dating apps can turn deadly when individuals with histories of violence and inability to handle rejection are given access to potential victims without adequate screening or warning. Christina had taken reasonable precautions, meeting in a public place, telling multiple people about her plans, conducting a first date in a restaurant rather than a private location. But these measures proved inadequate against someone determined to harm her when faced with rejection. The tragedy sparked renewed calls for Match.com and similar platforms to implement criminal background screening and to disclose to users when potential matches have histories of violence, stalking, or harassment. Though as with previous cases, the dating industry has generally resisted such requirements. Arizona legislators introduced a bill in the wake of Christina's murder that would have required dating platforms operating in the state to conduct background checks and inform users of any violent criminal histories. But the legislation stalled amid lobbying from tech industry groups and concerns about privacy and implementation logistics. Christina's case has been featured in safety awareness campaigns emphasizing that even seemingly normal, pleasant first dates can end in violence when perpetrators are triggered by rejection, and that individuals using dating apps should always inform multiple people of their plans, maintain communication throughout dates, and have exit strategies if situations become uncomfortable. The case also illustrated the particular danger posed by individuals who have learned to hide their violent tendencies during initial interactions, presenting themselves as normal, stable, boring even, while harboring the capacity for explosive violence when their expectations are not met. Mental health professionals who have examined cases like Harris's point to the combination of paranoid personality traits, narcissistic injury in response to rejection, and poor impulse control as creating a particularly dangerous profile, and they emphasize the importance of early intervention and monitoring of individuals who show these patterns before they escalate to lethal violence. As of 2025, David Harris remains incarcerated in Arizona State Prison, and while there is no possibility of parole, he has continued to demonstrate the same inability to accept responsibility and tendency to blame others that characterized his behavior throughout the case, with prison reports indicating he blames Christina for her own death because she rejected him. Christina's son has graduated from college and pursued a career in education like his mother, channeling his grief into honoring her memory by following the profession she loved and by advocating for teacher safety and support. The case remains a stark example of how the convenience and accessibility of online dating must be balanced with awareness of the very real dangers that exist, and that platforms facilitating these connections have an ongoing responsibility to implement meaningful safety measures even when doing so is costly or complicated. Christina Ferreira deserved to experience the companionship and connection she was seeking without being murdered by someone whose inability to handle rejection led to murderous violence. And her case stands as a reminder that we as a society must do better in protecting individuals who seek human connection through digital platforms from those who would exploit these tools to cause harm. Number 10. Michelle Zhang. The multiple platform predator Michelle Zhang was a 31-year-old software engineer working for a major tech company in San Francisco, California, part of the Bay Area's thriving technology industry, and enjoying a comfortable lifestyle that reflected her professional success and financial stability. Michelle had immigrated to the United States from China as a teenager, excelled academically, earned both undergraduate and graduate degrees in computer science from prestigious universities, and built an impressive career in a competitive field where Asian women often faced both racial and gender-based discrimination, making her accomplishments all the more significant. Michelle had always been somewhat introverted and found traditional social interactions challenging, preferring the structure and logic of coding to the unpredictable dynamics of dating and relationships, but by her early 30s, she felt ready to invest energy in her personal life and potentially find a long-term partner. In late 2018, Michelle joined multiple dating platforms including Tinder, Bumble, and Coffee Meets Bagel, reasoning that using several apps would increase her chances of meeting compatible people and that different platforms might attract different types of users. She approached online dating with the same analytical mindset she brought to her work, carefully crafting profiles that accurately represented her interests and goals, being selective about matches, and establishing clear criteria for what she was looking for in a partner. Among the many matches and messages Michelle received across the various platforms was someone she encountered on Coffee Meets Bagel named Daniel, whose profile suggested he was a 34-year-old product manager at a different tech company, sharing Michelle's background in the technology industry and claiming to appreciate the challenges faced by Asian Americans in corporate America. Daniel's profile included professional-looking photos, discussion of career ambitions and work-life balance concerns, and references to enjoying both the cultural offerings of San Francisco and outdoor activities in Northern California, creating a picture of someone who would understand Michelle's lifestyle and experiences. Their initial conversations on Coffee Meets Bagel covered familiar ground for two tech industry professionals. Discussions of company cultures, favorite projects, challenging technical problems, and the peculiar social dynamics of the Bay Area startup scene. Michelle felt comfortable with Daniel because his experiences seemed to mirror her own, and because his communication style was thoughtful and respectful, avoiding the aggressive or overly sexualized approaches she had encountered from many other matches. After several weeks of messaging on the app and transitioning to text communication in December 2018, Daniel suggested they meet for coffee at a popular cafe in the Mission District, a public location that Michelle considered safe and convenient. Their first meeting in mid-December went well enough that Michelle agreed to a second date, and over the following weeks, she and Daniel met several more times, gradually building what Michelle believed might develop into a meaningful relationship. However, Michelle began to notice some concerning patterns in Daniel's behavior. He was often vague about specifics regarding his supposedly successful tech career, unable to answer basic questions about products or technologies he claimed to work with. He was resistant to connecting on LinkedIn or introducing Michelle to any of his supposed friends or colleagues, and he frequently requested to borrow money for various reasons, starting with small amounts but gradually increasing his requests, and becoming defensive when Michelle questioned why someone with a successful product manager salary needed frequent loans. By February 2019, Michelle had lent Daniel approximately $15,000 under various pretenses, money he had promised to repay but hadn't, and she was becoming increasingly suspicious that Daniel was not who he claimed to be. When Michelle finally conducted a more thorough search of Daniel's supposed employer and tried to verify his employment, she discovered that he had never worked there and that much of what he had told her about his professional background was fabricated. Confronting Daniel about these discrepancies led to an angry exchange in which he became verbally aggressive, demanded that Michelle stop questioning him, and made vaguely threatening comments about what might happen if she caused problems for him. Frightened by this sudden shift in behavior and determined to understand who she had actually been dating, Michelle did what she should perhaps have done earlier. She conducted a reverse image search on the photos Daniel had been using and discovered they had been stolen from a real person's social media accounts, someone who had no knowledge his images were being misused. She also found that Daniel had created profiles on multiple dating platforms using different names and variations of the same stolen photos, suggesting a systematic pattern of targeting multiple women simultaneously. Michelle immediately ceased contact with Daniel and consulted with an attorney about recovering the money she had lent him, but the attorney explained that without knowing Daniel's real identity, pursuing civil action would be difficult, and advised her to report the situation to law enforcement as potential fraud. Michelle filed a report with the San Francisco Police Department, providing all the communications, financial records of the loans, and information about the fake profiles she had discovered. The investigation that followed revealed something far more disturbing than simple financial fraud. The person Michelle knew as Daniel was actually Richard Chun, a 38-year-old con artist with an extensive history of targeting Asian American women through dating apps, using multiple fake identities across various platforms, and in several cases, escalating from financial fraud to sexual assault and other violence when victims discovered his deception and attempted to cut contact or report him to authorities. Chun had apparently been operating these various fraudulent dating profiles for years, carefully targeting successful Asian American women in the tech industry whom he believed would be both financially capable of lending him money and potentially less likely to report being victimized due to cultural factors or concerns about professional reputation. Investigators discovered that Chun had been simultaneously running similar scams on at least 7 other women in the Bay Area alone, all of whom he had met through different dating platforms, and that his total fraud across these victims amounted to well over $100,000. More alarmingly, as detectives dug deeper into Chen's activities, they found evidence connecting him to at least 3 sexual assaults of women he had met through dating apps. Assaults that had been reported but where the victims had been unable to provide enough information to identify the perpetrator because Chun had used false names and stolen photos. One particularly disturbing case involved a woman who had confronted Chun about his fraud and had subsequently been stalked and assaulted in her own apartment, an attack that had left her severely traumatized and that Chun had apparently carried out as retaliation for her threatening to expose him. The realization that Michelle had been dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple financial scammer, someone with a documented history of violence against women who challenged him, was terrifying in retrospect, as Michelle recognized how easily she could have become another victim of assault or worse if she had pushed the confrontation further or if Chun had perceived her as a serious threat. Police launched a coordinated effort to locate Chun, working with the FBI due to the interstate nature of some of his activities and the potential for federal fraud charges, and they contacted all the dating platforms where Chun had created profiles, requesting that his accounts be suspended and that the platforms preserve all data related to his activities for potential use as evidence. The investigation revealed the shocking extent to which Chun had been able to operate across multiple platforms simultaneously without detection. He had created over 30 different profiles using various stolen photos and fabricated biographical information, had been active on at least 8 different dating apps and websites, and had successfully defrauded or assaulted more than 15 women over a period of approximately 5 years without being caught, moving between victims and platforms. quickly enough that patterns were not immediately apparent to individual platform administrators or to law enforcement agencies that might have been investigating isolated incidents. Chun was eventually located and arrested in Los Angeles in April 2019, where he had fled after learning that Michelle had reported him to police, and where he had already begun the same pattern with new victims on dating apps in that area. Upon his arrest, investigators found devices containing evidence of his extensive fraudulent activities, including communications with dozens of women, financial records of fraudulent transactions, and disturbing notes that appeared to categorize and rate his victims based on their perceived vulnerability and financial resources. The case against Chun included charges of fraud, identity theft, stalking, multiple counts of sexual assault, and various computer crimes related to his creation of fake profiles and use of stolen personal information. The prosecution worked with many of Chen's victims to build a comprehensive case demonstrating the systematic and predatory nature of his activities. Though several victims were reluctant to participate in the prosecution due to embarrassment about having been deceived or fear of the personal and professional consequences of being publicly associated with the case, Michelle Zhang chose to testify, despite the personal discomfort and professional concerns about being identified as a victim, because she believed it was important to hold Chen accountable and to prevent him from victimizing others. The trial in 2020 presented extensive evidence of Chen's multi-year fraud and assault operation, including testimony from multiple victims, forensic analysis of his devices and the fake profiles he had created, financial records documenting the money he had fraudulently obtained, and evidence from sexual assault examinations and investigations linking him to attacks on women who had discovered his deceptions. The defense attempted to argue that the financial transactions had been gifts rather than loans and that the sexual encounters had been consensual, but the sheer volume of victims with nearly identical stories, the clear evidence of planned fraud and deception, and the documented violence against women who had threatened to expose him made these arguments completely untenable. Richard Chun was found guilty on multiple counts including fraud, sexual assault, stalking, and identity theft, and was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the extended period over which he had been victimizing women. The case exposed significant failures in how dating platforms monitor user activities and respond to reports of fraudulent or dangerous behavior, with investigators finding that Chen's accounts had been reported multiple times by suspicious matches or fraud victims, but that the platform's responses had been inadequate and uncoordinated, with accounts being suspended on one platform while Chun simply continued operating on others. The revelation that Chun had been simultaneously active on so many platforms while defrauding and assaulting numerous victims sparked calls for better coordination between dating services in identifying and banning dangerous users, and for implementing systems that would flag individuals creating multiple accounts or exhibiting patterns consistent with fraud or predatory behavior. Several of Chen's victims filed civil lawsuits against the dating platforms, arguing that inadequate safety measures and failure to respond appropriately to reports of fraudulent accounts had enabled Chun to continue victimizing women long after warning signs should have triggered intervention. Though these cases faced significant legal obstacles due to Section 230 protections that generally shield online platforms from liability for user-generated content and activities, the case became a reference point in ongoing debates about the responsibilities of dating platforms to protect users and the need for better regulatory frameworks governing how these services operate and what safety standards they must meet. Michelle Zhang underwent counseling to process the experience of having been deceived and financially defrauded by someone she had trusted, and she eventually became an advocate within the Asian American community for awareness about romance scams and fraud, speaking openly about her experience to help reduce the stigma that often prevents victims from reporting such crimes or seeking help. The tech industry community in San Francisco, where Michelle was well known and respected professionally, rallied around her and other victims, with some companies implementing educational programs about online safety and fraud awareness for their employees. Michelle's willingness to speak publicly about her experience, despite the personal and professional risks, helped other victims feel empowered to come forward and report their experiences with Chan and other predators operating similarly, leading to additional investigations and potentially preventing future victimizations. The case illustrated how sophisticated predators can exploit the specific dynamics of particular communities. In this case, targeting Asian American women in tech who might be less likely to report fraud due to cultural factors or professional concerns. And it highlighted the importance of creating support systems and reducing stigma so that victims feel safe coming forward regardless of their background or circumstances. As of 2025, Richard Chun remains incarcerated in federal prison, and law enforcement continues to investigate whether there are additional victims who have not yet come forward or cases that have not yet been connected to his activities. Dating platforms have implemented some enhanced safety features in the years since Chen's arrest, including better tools for reporting suspicious behavior, improved coordination between platforms to identify individuals banned from one service who attempt to create accounts on others, and enhanced verification processes. Though experts argue these measures remain inadequate given the continuing reports of fraud and assault connected to online dating. Michelle Zhang has continued her successful tech career while also maintaining her advocacy work, using her platform and visibility to push for better safety standards in the technology industry broadly and in dating platforms specifically, arguing that companies have a responsibility to design products that minimize opportunities for exploitation and harm. Her case, along with the many others documented in this compilation, stands as evidence that while online dating has become a normalized and often valuable tool for meeting potential partners, it has also created new vulnerabilities and enabled predatory behavior at a scale that would have been impossible in the pre-digital era, and that addressing these dangers requires coordinated action by platforms, regulators, law enforcement, and users themselves to create systems that facilitate human connection while providing meaningful protection against those who would exploit these tools to cause harm.